cold settles over the northern French countryside, like a weight meant to press the land into silence. It is December 27th, 1941, a little after 3 o'clock in the morning, and the night is colder than anything the men on patrol expected. The thermometers in their pockets read -6 degrees Celsius, though each breath feels colder than that, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Frost grips every exposed surface. Fields lie rigid beneath a glassy film that cracks softly beneath each boot print. A thin fog flows in slow currents between the hedgerows, thick enough that visibility collapses to just a few meters, as though the world ends at arm's reach. The moon is a faint suggestion behind a milky haze, and the only light comes from the vague pale smear overhead. The German patrol moves cautiously, 5 men spread in a loose file, each far enough apart to avoid a single burst of fire wiping them all out, yet close enough to feel the presence of the others. Their breaths rise like steam from a vent, merging with the fog. Their hands, gloved but still stiff with cold, tighten around their rifles. Their boots crunch on the frost, each step sounding unnervingly loud, in a world where everything else has been muted by winter. One of them notices it first. A faint noise drifting through the fog. Not a sound belonging to the field, or the forest, or the machinery of war. Something threaded, melodic, almost mournful. A wavering tone that seems to glide above the frozen earth and slide between the hedges with unnatural ease. He stops, lifts a hand, and the rest halt, scanning the murk for the source. The patrol leader frowns. There should be nothing out here but the familiar creaks of icy branches and the distant rumble of trucks far behind their lines. Yet this sound is none of those. It is something older, something out of place, something they cannot categorize. The melody grows clearer, low at first, then rising, almost like the sustained cry of an animal, but more deliberate, more crafted. A reedy swell, bending and trembling as though coaxed from the air itself. None of them speak. None of them dare move. The patrol leader grips his rifle and tries to pinpoint direction, but the fog plays tricks, bouncing sound from one wall of white to another. The tune seems to come from the left, then the right, then behind them, then ahead, everywhere and nowhere at once. Another man stiffens. He has heard stories. Rumors passed along in barracks or whispered by men returning from night duty. Rumors so absurd they are usually dismissed. Tales of a strange figure moving through the Allied lines. A man with the trappings of another age, whose arrival was preceded not by gunfire, but by a haunting ancient instrument. A warrior who fought this modern war using weapons so outlandish they felt like a mocking challenge to the mechanized brutality around him. But rumors are one thing. Fog-bound, freezing reality is another. The melody shifts again, rising into a keening wail, a sound that feels at once human and beyond human. Something about it feels like mourning, something else like warning, and still something else like a provocation directed solely at them. The men exchange glances, trying to read each other's expressions through the fog. But each face is just a pale blur, made indistinct by frost and fear. The patrol leader signals them forward, slow, silent, rifles raised. Their boots crunch, pause, crunch again. With each cautious step, the sound grows stranger, as if it isn't just music, but a message. They edge toward the hedgerow, the fog swirling around them in ghost-like motions. Then it stops. Silence drops over them so suddenly and completely that for a moment they wonder if their ears have failed. In the absence of sound, their own breathing becomes thunderous. Their heartbeats feel misplaced, echoing where they shouldn't. The frost on branches seems to creak louder. The fog thickens, swallowing the shapes of the world, turning trees and hedges into blurred walls of gray. Then something else replaces the silence, not a sound, but a sensation. Creeping along the edges of awareness, the sense of being watched, hunted. Something moving in the fog, unseen but deliberate, measured, purposeful. The patrol leader scans left and right, senses tightening like wire. He lifts a hand to signal a staggered formation. A faint scrape comes from somewhere ahead, a whisper of metal brushing metal, but not the metal of a rifle, something longer, something heavier, something drawn slowly through the air with intent. 2 of the men turn sharply toward the sound. The fog shifts. A darker shape flickers at the edge of vision, gone before the mind can register what it is. The patrol leader exhales sharply, barely keeping control as adrenaline spikes. Another sound rises, softer this time, a thin, high whistle slicing the air, quick, silent, deadly. One of the men staggers, not understanding what has happened. He reaches toward his throat, then toward his chest, as though unable to choose which pain to respond to first. He collapses backward onto the frost, his rifle falling soundlessly into the grass. The others recoil in shock. No gunshot, no muzzle flash, nothing but the sudden, brutal finality of death delivered from nowhere. One soldier kneels beside him. His gloved hand hesitates before touching the man's coat. When he finds the shaft protruding from just beneath the collarbone, a wooden shaft, his breath catches in his throat. He pulls back, eyes widening. His voice dies before it can form. A bow, a medieval bow. In this war of tanks and machine guns and dive bombers, some part of their minds cracks under the absurdity. Another faint movement ripples through the fog, a silhouette, tall, straight-backed, slow, purposeful. Something glints near the figure's side, steel catching the ghost light. Long steel, unmistakable even in blurred outline. One soldier mumbles a prayer under his breath, though the words never quite form. Another tries to steady his rifle, but his hands tremble so violently the barrel wavers. The silhouette vanishes again into the fog. Silence returns. Then the bagpipes start once more. But this time, they are closer. The tune is no longer mournful. It is triumphant, defiant. A declaration of presence. Each note cuts like ice through the air, vibrating in the bones more than in the ears. One of the Germans breaks. He spins and begins to run, slipping on the frost. The patrol leader yells silently in fury, grabbing the man's coat and forcing him back, but panic is a contagion. Two more step backward, instinctively recoiling from the direction of the music. The fog swallows every sense of distance. The patrol leader tries to regain control, but another arrow hisses past, embedding itself in a tree with a dull, decisive thud. It feels like a punctuation mark, directed not at flesh, but at their courage. Somewhere beyond the veil of mist, boots shift softly in grass. A blade slides free from a scabbard with an unmistakable ring. And within the next moment, the fog itself seems to draw breath. They do not see the man clearly. They only see the effect he has, the way the fog seems to coil around him as if recognizing a force from another century. A presence that does not belong in this war of engines and explosives, yet fits too perfectly in the quiet spaces between. The patrol retreats a step, then another. Breath sharp, eyes wide. Hearts pounding. They feel something vast pressing in. Not a squad, not a platoon. One man, yet somehow more than one man. A figure sharpened by legend even before legend existed. None of them know his name. None of them have ever seen him. But they all understand, in the marrow of their fear, that this is the one the rumors described, the one with the bow, the one with the sword, the one who fought with the exuberance of a forgotten age, the one who would later walk 42 armed men into captivity with nothing but confidence and a blade. The patrol leader swallows hard, frost cracking on his scarf. He feels something shift in the air, momentum turning against them, bending the night around a single, unwanted truth. What they are facing is not a soldier in any traditional sense. He is not bound by the patterns they were trained to expect, or the logic of modern combat. He is an anomaly carved into human form, a reminder that even in the age of tanks and dive bombers, the past can still carve itself violently into the present. A shape breaks through the fog, a sudden lunging movement. Steel arcs, faintly illuminated, slicing through mist in a gleaming curve. The Germans scramble, stumbling, slipping, firing blindly into the white void. Muzzle flashes burst like dying stars, swallowed instantly by the fog. But the figure does not behave like a man pinned by gunfire. He shifts with unnerving precision, landing silently, moving with an agility that belongs on a battlefield centuries older. The sword glints once more, a slash too fast to follow. A cry erupts. Another man falls. The bagpipes stop. The silence returns. The fog thickens again, as though closing around him like a cloak. The patrol leader realizes this is not merely a fight, it is a hunt, and they are prey. He pivots, gesturing urgently for withdrawal. Retreat, regroup, report. Anything but stand against this phantom for another minute, but the fog swallows every direction, turning the field into a labyrinth with invisible walls. Footsteps crunch. Not theirs. His. The patrol leader's breath turns shallow. His rifle trembles. He feels something behind him. A presence, a certainty, a cold weight. He turns. Nothing. Then a shape forms to his left. He swings his rifle, too slow. A gloved hand shoves the weapon aside. The faintest gleam of steel at his throat, not cutting, but reminding. A warning, a promise. Before he can even process what is happening, the figure vanishes again, leaving only a parting chill in the air. The patrol does not need further persuasion. They scatter, stumbling back toward their lines, slipping on frost, desperate to reach safety and the certainty of walls and firelight. Behind them, the fog closes like a curtain. The night returns to silence. And somewhere within that silence, the pipes begin again, softly, almost playfully, as though satisfied with the fear they have sown. The man sheathes the sword, picks up his bow, adjusts the strap of the pipes across his back, then vanishes into the hedgerow, moving with the unhurried confidence of a ghost satisfied with its work. What they didn't know was that the man hunting them carried weapons from another century. The war that raged across continents had no room for such anomalies, at least not on paper. But the war did not exist solely on paper. It existed in the frozen nights, in the fog-bound hedgerows, in the places where logic blurred and fear sharpened perception. It existed in the gaps where one extraordinary individual could bend reality through audacity alone. And as he slipped back through the fields, breath misting, boots silent on the frost, the true scale of the conflict pressed on the horizon beyond him. Entire nations collided in an era defined by mechanization, where battles were measured not in miles, but in the consumption of steel and fuel. The Second World War was the first truly global conflict in which machines, tanks, aircraft, mechanized infantry dictated strategy. It was the era when ranges were measured in kilometers, when artillery reshaped landscapes, when bombers darkened cities. Millions of men clashed across deserts, forests, islands, and oceans, and the ultimate outcome seemed dictated by factories, supply chains, and engines, not by the skill of any single individual. And yet, in the midst of this modern storm, he emerged. A single officer who treated the battlefield as though it were carved from the same wood as an old longbow. A man who chose not to compete with the industrial scale of war, but to sidestep it entirely, to fight as though the world had never changed, as though steel and smoke were still measured, warrior to warrior, act to act, courage to courage. What made his presence so impossible was not simply the weapons he carried, but the way he carried himself. The confidence, the clarity, the unshakable sense that war, no matter how vast, still bowed to the will of individuals bold enough to carve their own path through it. What he did next defied belief, but before the legend could be understood, it had to be traced back, beyond the fog, beyond the dead German on the frozen ground, beyond even the longbow itself, to the origins of the man who would one day stride into a firefight armed with a sword, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He was born into a time that no longer matched him, shaped by skills and instincts that the modern world had forgotten. And as the war escalated into its most brutal years, those forgotten skills would find their relevance once more. He was a man born out of time, a man who read the world differently, a man who understood that the essence of combat had not changed, even if the tools had. And soon, the world's most modern war would meet a man armed for an older century. The winds that carried him across continents were shaped by forces larger than his own story, by the grinding gears of a war machine consuming nations. But his role within that machine would be the anomaly that refused to conform, the gear that spun counter to all others, the reminder that war was still, at its core, about individuals who dared. But this was only the beginning. The path toward legend rarely begins with a trumpet blast or a newspaper headline. More often, it begins quietly, in small moments, in habits formed long before anyone understands their significance, and long before he marched into the fog of northern France with a sword at his hip, long before an arrow hissed across a frozen field into the first German of the war killed by a medieval weapon. He was simply a boy growing into a world where he did not quite fit. He grew up in a Britain straddling eras. The last remnants of the Victorian age lingered in the architecture, in the manners, in the rigid social expectations. Yet the hum of machinery and the acceleration of modern life had already begun to reshape everything. Cars replaced horses. Radios replaced hearthside conversation. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the globe now felt the tremors of its coming challenges. But while the world around him marched toward the future, he gravitated instinctively toward the past, toward craft, toward precision, toward disciplines whose origins reached back centuries. Long before he ever set foot on a battlefield, he had taken to the bow with an ease that startled those who watched him. He learned the weapon not as a hobbyist, but as though it were encoded in his blood. He understood the flex of the wooden limb, the feel of the string under tension, the subtle shift of balance in his hand. When he drew, the strength came not only from his arms and back, but from a kind of quiet, focused intent, a sense that the weapon belonged not just in his grip, but in his worldview. A bow, after all, demands patience, timing, deliberation. It rewards calm in the midst of tension, clarity in the midst of motion. And while the world sped up around him, he trained himself in an art that required slowing down, listening, and separating signal from noise. He practiced at dawn, at dusk, in wind and rain, until instinct replaced effort. He learned the pipes, too, another relic of an older time, but one whose voice could fill a landscape, command attention, and stir emotion in ways few other instruments could. The pipes taught breath control, discipline, and endurance. They taught the power of sound to unsettle and inspire. They taught him how to command a battlefield before he ever set foot on one. And, of course, the sword. He trained not out of nostalgia, but out of fascination with the physicality of it, the balance, the arc, the momentum. A sword is, in essence, an extension of posture, of movement, of presence. It is a weapon that requires proximity and courage. It is a declaration of intent carved into steel. Most people learned such archaic arts as curiosities. He learned them as though preparing for something that others would have called impossible, long before the war gave him the stage upon which they would matter. These early disciplines formed a man built for a different age, and while he grew into a Britain that assumed war, if it came again, would be a matter of engines and explosives, he quietly cultivated abilities that belonged to an era when courage took physical form. But despite his affinity for older ways, he did not avoid the world. Quite the opposite. He chased it. He sought adventure long before he sought combat. He traveled widely, pushing through jungles and deserts, testing himself not against people, but against nature. He wandered through Burma, where the air clung thick to the skin and the monsoon rains turned the world into a churning river. He learned resilience there, the ability to remain calm in the oppressive humidity, to maintain clarity even as the physical environment sought to erode it. The jungle taught him patience and adaptability. He journeyed across Europe, climbing peaks and moving through landscapes far removed from the quiet fields of his childhood. Mountains carved discipline into him. They taught him to measure effort, to understand limits, to push through fatigue, to trust his own preparation. These experiences shaped something far more valuable than mere skills. They shaped a mindset, a belief that the world could be navigated through boldness, discipline, and adaptability. A belief that fear was merely a signal, not a barrier. A belief that hardship was not something to be endured, but something to be shaped into strength. He carried all this with him when he joined the military. And when the world spiraled into war once more, a war not of aristocratic duels or cavalry charges, but of panzers and dive bombers, he stepped into its chaos with tools that made no sense at first glance. But what he brought to the battlefield was not anachronism, it was asymmetry. The more complex war became, the more valuable his simplicity became. A longbow could not jam. A sword required no ammunition. Bagpipes required only breath to turn fear into hesitation. The war rewarded efficiency. He offered audacity. And when the war finally engulfed Europe, when France fell and Britain stood alone behind a thin strip of sea, when the continent was carved into occupied territories and resistance pockets, he felt something stir deep within him, a compulsion not just to fight, but to fight his way. The first major test of that philosophy came in the coastal fields near Lepinette. There, The hedgerows had grown thick from years of summer sun and winter rain. They formed natural corridors and ambush points, walls of twisted branches and thorn that bent under frost and sprang back under boots. The ground was uneven, soft in places, and rock-hard in others, shaped by centuries of cultivation. Dawn was only just beginning to touch the horizon when he and his unit took positions. The light was weak and blue-tinged, filtering through streaks of morning mist. The scent of damp earth rose beneath their boots. Somewhere in the distance, a motor sputtered, a German transport shifting gears as it approached along a narrow lane. The truth is that the moment when he decided to use the bow was not a dramatic one. It did not come with a sudden flash of inspiration or with any ceremonial significance. It came simply because the terrain suited it, because silence mattered, and because the enemy presented an opportunity. He moved through the hedgerow without sound, slipping between branches with the fluidity of someone used to wilderness. The bow felt natural in his grip, light compared to the rifle slung across his back, yet heavy enough in purpose to anchor his decision. The string vibrated faintly with tension as he drew it back. Through a gap in the branches, he saw the German patrol, 5 men moving in a loose column, relaxed but attentive, rifles slung across chests, boots scuffing soft earth. Their breath rose in thin plumes in the cool morning air. He inhaled, feeling the cold settle in his lungs. He exhaled, letting the world sharpen into stillness. The arrow flew so smoothly that even he barely registered the release. It cut through the air in a clean, whispering arc. The nearest German felt it before anyone else heard it. The impact struck just above the heart, a sound like knuckles tapping wood, muted by flesh and fabric. The man collapsed instantly. His companions froze, stunned by the absence of the expected gunshot. No muzzle flash, no report, no smoke. Just death delivered with uncanny silence. Before confusion could harden into response, the rest of the ambush erupted around them. But the moment that mattered, the moment that wrote itself into the ledger of legend, was that single arrow. That instant when the past reached forward through time and asserted its relevance with lethal clarity. Many soldiers have first kills that come and go without note. This one echoed across the war with disproportionate weight, because it was not simply a kill. It was a statement. The Germans thought it an anomaly, a strange, isolated incident, something to laugh off nervously at first, then quickly bury beneath the weight of more conventional engagements. They were wrong. For the man with the bow understood something critical about war that most soldiers never truly grasp. Fear does not depend on numbers. It depends on unpredictability. It depends on the sense that the battlefield itself has become uncertain. And with that one arrow, he began to cultivate a reputation that grew larger each time he stepped into the shadows of conflict. What he did next defied belief. His presence on operations soon turned into a tactical advantage because he broke the rules of predictability. Commanders expect rifle fire. They expect grenades, machine guns, mortars. They prepare for those things. They do not prepare for the sound of pipes rising in the distance. They do not prepare for the sight of a sword glinting in the corner of their vision. They do not prepare for the sudden, silent death delivered by a bow from an unseen angle. Every weapon he carried had a purpose beyond the obvious. The longbow was silent, fast, and terrifying. The sword was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The bagpipes were presence, identity, and intimidation distilled into sound. Each one amplified his intent. Each one made him appear less like a soldier and more like an apparition, something conjured from the mythic past to unsettle the hyper-mechanized present. And as the war deepened, as night raids grew more frequent, and operations pushed deeper into occupied territory, his reputation spread. Among Allied forces, it was admiration mixed with disbelief. Among German troops, it was something closer to dread. He carried that dread with him into the next series of operations, raids that stitched his legend into the broader fabric of the war. In Italy, he marched over rough, mountainous terrain, where the air thinned at altitude and the terrain favored ambushes. He moved ahead of his men, scouting under moonlight, his boots sure on the rocky ground. He used the terrain as if it were an extension of himself, knowing instinctively where the shadows would fall, where the wind would carry sound, where the enemy would least expect approach. He charged into skirmishes with his sword drawn, not out of vanity, but because a blade has a momentum that no rifle can match in close quarters. A sword intimidates at a range where the chaos of combat turns modern weapons into unwieldy clubs. A sword declares not just intent, but dominance. And in the confusion of night raids, the sight of a blade wielded with precision could break the morale of a squad before the first shot was fired. But this was only the beginning. His actions on the Italian front were bold, but his next moments would transform boldness into something approaching myth. One night operation in particular stands out. A moment so improbable it seemed to defy the logic of war. The details would echo through history, not only because of their audacity, but because of what they revealed about psychology on the battlefield. The night was moonless, the terrain a patchwork of ruined farmhouses and uneven fields. The walls of a bombed building cast jagged shadows across the ground. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wet stone. Allied forces approached a German position that intelligence suggested was lightly held. But intelligence was often an approximation, distorted by darkness and incomplete information. He moved ahead of the main force, as was his habit, slipping between broken walls and shattered beams. He heard German voices, low, tired, resigned to another long night in a war that felt increasingly uncertain. He counted them by sound alone. Then, with his sword drawn, not in a flourish but as a tool, he led the charge. The shock of it worked instantly. In the chaos of the assault, in the confusion of shadows and movement, the Germans miscalculated wildly. They saw his figure at the front, sword raised, pipes strapped across his back, and they assumed he had an entire assault force behind him. The boldness of the advance overwhelmed their sense of scale. Within minutes, 42 Germans surrendered to him, 42 armed soldiers, one man carrying a sword. The moment was so astonishing that even decades later, it remained a reference point for explaining who he was, what he represented, and why his legend endured. That surrender did not happen because of brute force. It happened because he understood something critical, that confidence can be mistaken for numbers, that audacity can masquerade as strength, and that the mind is often the first battleground. The surrender became a cornerstone of his identity in the war. It followed him like a shadow. It shaped how both sides perceived him. It shaped how operations were planned. It fed the growing sense that he was not just a skilled officer, but a force of nature, and he returned to that sense of audacity again and again. During raids on coastal strongholds, he wove through trenches with the ease of someone who understood terrain the way others understood maps. He used the bow where silence mattered. He used grenades where chaos was useful. He used the sword when the enemy least expected a close-quarter advance. His actions were never reckless. They were calculated, honed by instinct, and informed by his unusual mixture of skills. He did not chase danger for its own sake. He moved toward opportunity. Opportunities to disrupt, to intimidate, to confuse, to break the rhythm of enemy defenses. And every time he stepped into the field with his sword and bow, he reinforced the myth, not a myth built on exaggeration, but one built on deeds witnessed by dozens, recorded by superiors, and whispered by enemies. But war is unforgiving, even to legends. And it was during one of the more daring operations, an assault on a position bristling with machine guns, that his fortune ran thin. The operation was meant to be swift. The night was still. The terrain offered cover. But luck is a finite resource, even for those who seem dipped in myth. A mortar round landed explosively close. The world erupted in soil and flame and sound. When he regained awareness, he found himself among the injured. The battle surged forward without him, the night swallowing the movement of both sides. He was captured. For the first time in the war, the legend met a cage. His captors had no idea who he was in that moment. They saw only a British officer pulled from the rubble of a battlefield. They did not see the bow, they did not see the sword, they did not see the pipes. Those had been stripped away or lost in the chaos. He was transported to a camp far from the front, Sachsenhausen, a place designed not merely to imprison, but to erode the will of those inside. The conditions there were brutal. Cold seeped through walls that offered little shelter. Food came in small, insufficient portions that kept prisoners alive but rarely fed. The days blurred together in monotony and exhaustion. The guards enforced discipline not through efficiency, but through unpredictability and cruelty. The nights were restless, filled with the sound of shivering bodies and the distant cracks of rifles marking the end of attempted escapes. But captivity could not kill the legend. He observed the routines, he measured the patterns, he noted the shifts. The war outside continued to turn, and he knew that time was not his ally. Escape was not a question for him, it was an inevitability. And so, he made preparations. He studied the fences, the patrol routes, the weak points in the system. He cultivated the endurance necessary to survive the journey that would come after the escape, the long march through forests and fields, through hostile territory, through terrain far more dangerous than any battlefield. When he finally made his attempt, it was not driven by desperation, but by purpose. He slipped through the perimeter under cover of darkness. He moved quietly across frozen ground. The air cut into his lungs with every breath. Beyond the walls, the world was vast, cold, and unforgiving. Forests loomed like dark fortresses. Snow crunched beneath every step. Hunger gnawed. Fatigue lingered. But he pressed forward, sustained by something deeper than physical strength. He navigated by instinct and experience, avoiding patrols, slipping through the shadows of villages, finding shelter in the hollows of trees or in abandoned structures. The journey took a toll on his body. Weight shed, muscles strained, frost sinking into fingers and toes, but not on his will. He had carried a sword through battles where rifles dominated. He had carried a bow through fields riddled with machine gun fire. He had carried pipes into fog thick enough to swallow entire squads. Now he carried only himself. Yet that was enough. At last, after days that felt like weeks, he crossed back into friendly territory. When the Allied soldiers found him, ragged and frostbitten, they saw not a man saved, but a man returning to his purpose. His escape did not end the legend, it amplified it. But what he did after returning would show that even the war's darkest moments could not break the spirit of a man who fought like he belonged to another century. What followed was not triumph, nor celebration, nor the roar of a victorious regiment marching back across liberated ground. It came instead in the form of a cold, metallic click somewhere behind him, small, almost polite, nearly lost beneath the last echoes of distant artillery, but unmistakable. A weapon's safety shifting, a decision being made by someone he could not see. The forest exhaled a stillness that felt wrong. Mad Jack Churchill turned slowly, boots sinking into snow, softened by the fading night, and found himself staring down the barrels of German rifles held by a semicircle of exhausted soldiers who looked as if they'd been carved from frost, their uniforms dirty, their movements cautious, their expressions not triumphant, but wary, as if they'd caught not a man, but a storm that had momentarily paused to regard them. He had no sword in hand, no bow slung across his shoulder, no bagpipes hanging from his chest. Only the cold, the dark, and the sudden weight of numbers pressing against him from all directions. He raised his hands, slow, deliberate, knowing the war did not always select the moment of its turnings. And just like that, the tide of his legend shifted once more, not with a scream or a grenade, but with an unadorned surrender that any soldier, even a mythic one, could be forced into. Because even legends bleed. Even legends falter, and even legends are captured. But this was not the end. It was merely the next chamber in a story that refused to be contained. They marched him under guard, boots crunching over snow that glowed faintly beneath a moon, smudged behind heavy cloud. The night smelled of oil, of cordite, of the dampness of winter swirling through steel and cloth. His captors moved in rigid silence, each man glancing nervously toward the strange officer who had terrified entire companies across Europe. Some had heard whispers, some had seen bodies marked by arrows. Others had experienced the moment when he stepped out of darkness with blade raised, like a piece of the Middle Ages erupted into the modern world. Now they watched him with a kind of hesitant awe, as if he might burst into song or attack them with nothing but the air itself. When dawn finally broke, gray and hesitant, they delivered him into the hard walls of captivity. A new phase of winter waited for him behind the bars of Sachsenhausen. Inside the camp, time lost its shape. The hours stretched, then folded, then collapsed into one another until days felt like a single, unbroken block of cold hunger and muffled footsteps. The barracks smelled of damp wool and despair. The walls seemed to pulse with the exhaustion of thousands of prisoners whose morale had been scraped thin by years of confinement. Soldiers, officers, resistance fighters, each man carried a shadow. Jack Churchill, stripped of weapons and freedom, carried only the memory of the sword's weight, the bowstring's pull, and the bagpipe's vibration against his ribs. These were not mere images. They were anchor points, keeping him from sinking into the stagnation that swallowed others. He studied the routines of the guards, the pacing of patrols, the subtle rhythms of inspection rounds. Days became reconnaissance. Meals became moments of analysis. Every cough, every clank of keys, every shift of boots on concrete became information. Because he had no intention of rotting behind wire, Sachsenhausen had broken many, but it would not break him. His escape began not with an explosion or a diversion, but with a single decision carved quietly into the bone of his resolve. A decision to move, to act, to refuse stillness. He understood the perimeter, the angles, the blind spots, the thin seams between guard duties. And one night, beneath a sky stretched tight with winter stars, he slipped through a gap in the structure, a gap that existed only for seconds, only at the intersection of two guard rotations, only if timed with the precision of a blade strike. Snow cushioned his steps as he crossed the first stretch of open ground. Frost bit into the exposed skin of his face. The camp behind him breathed in slow, oblivious rhythm, unaware that the myth it had captured was dissolving into the night like smoke. The nearby forest waited like a cathedral of black silence. He reached the tree line. Then he ran. Branches snapped against his uniform. Roots clawed at his boots. Every breath tasted like glass. But he moved with the ragged determination of a man who understood that each heartbeat was a countdown. He traveled across frozen earth for hours, then days, navigating by instinct, moonlight, and a sense of direction sharpened by survival training and the raw stubbornness that defined him. During that brutal march, he stopped only when his body demanded it, not to sleep, but to lean against a tree long enough for dizziness to fade. His hunger grew into a wolf gnawing at the inside of his ribs. His throat burned from the cold. His feet felt like stones. He crossed rail lines, skirted villages, and waded through icy streams that stole his breath. More than once, he heard distant engines or caught glimpses of search parties combing the region. Still, he moved. Still, he refused to break. When he finally crossed into friendly territory, gaunt and exhausted, he resembled a phantom more than a soldier. But he carried with him the same unshakable spirit that had driven him through countless battles. Upon reaching his own lines, a strange mixture of disbelief and admiration rippled through those who recognized him. Mad Jack had escaped a place where escape was not permitted, and he returned to the war, as if returning to a familiar fire. But by then, the conflict was shifting. The vast machinery of the Allied armies was grinding relentlessly toward victory. The war that had defined him, that had forged his legend in the iron clashes of Europe, was nearing its end. Yet he watched the final chapters of the conflict unfold with a restlessness that never left his eyes. For him, battle had not been madness or addiction. It had been clarity, purpose, a stage where skill and instinct fused into something almost sacred. He would later be sent to Burma, expecting to fight again, only for the war to end before he could reach the front. The news struck him with a complexity few could understand, relief, perhaps, but also a sense of interruption, as if a story he had been meant to complete had abruptly closed itself. The modern world felt different to him now. It felt quieter, less urgent, less alive. But legends do not fade simply because the guns fall silent. When the war ended, he carried his sword with him into peace. He carried his longbow, his bagpipes, not as relics, but as reminders of what a man can be when he refuses to accept the limits of his era. He returned to military service, teaching, training, pushing new generations of soldiers to understand the value of discipline shaped by tradition. He taught archery. He taught navigation. He taught principles that bridge centuries. Most officers entered the post-war years wearing medals. Mad Jack entered carrying the same conviction that had guided him from the very beginning. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. He said it not as a joke, nor as a line meant to charm a crowd, but as a simple truth forged in the cold winds of Europe, in the quiet nights before battle, in the moments where steel mattered more for morale than mechanics. He lived long after the war, moving through life with the same unyielding stride he had carried into combat. He sailed, he played the bagpipes, he competed in archery, he traveled across shores and forests like a man cataloging the world while searching for something he had once known in the intensity of combat. Some said he was born in the wrong century. Others said he was the last echo of a world that had disappeared long before tanks rolled across Europe. To many who met him, he felt like a paradox, part warrior, part philosopher, part living artifact of a time when courage bore sharper edges. But those who studied his wartime record understood the truth. He was a bridge, a connection between past and present, a reminder that even in the age of mechanized war, the human spirit could erupt in forms ancient and unstoppable. He grew old, but never fragile. His posture remained straight. His gaze remained sharp. The world softened in places, but he moved through it as though still expecting to hear the distant thunder of artillery beyond the horizon. When he finally passed, the news settled across military circles with a quiet weight. Not the weight of shock. He had lived a long life, but the weight of knowing that a thread had been cut, a thread connecting eras, a thread woven from steel and frost and the deep resonant drone of bagpipes echoing across European valleys. He was buried with honor, not because he had chased glory, but because he had embodied a principle older than warfare itself. That courage, when expressed fully, becomes a kind of myth. His story endures not because of any single act, not because of the arrow at Lepanett, nor the sword at Salerno, nor the 42 Germans captured with nothing but confidence and steel, but because the sum of these acts created a portrait of a man impossible to categorize. His legend remains a testament to the fact that history is not always shaped by machines, nor by strategy, nor by the unseen hands of distant commanders. Sometimes it is shaped by individuals, by their will, their nerve, their refusal to become ordinary. A British officer carrying medieval weapons into the largest mechanized war in human history should have been an anecdote. Instead, he became an icon. And though time has eroded the trenches, dissolved the camps, and quieted the echoes of artillery, the image of Mad Jack Churchill continues to move through the memory of the Second World War like a figure who stepped sideways through time, fought with a code older than empires, and survived by blending audacity with discipline. His legacy remains immensely human, a reminder that in the darkest hours of global conflict, individuals can still carve their own legends, against the roar of tanks, against the machine guns, against the overwhelming machinery of total war. He proved that courage is not defined by the era, but by the man. And now, as his story is carried forward here, across screens, across continents, across generations, it becomes part of a wider memory, part of the living history that binds us all to the past and to each other. Because stories like his must be kept alive. Stories like his remind us what individuals can do. Stories like his refuse to fade. And if you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.